This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Christine Blashford, www.wokeupthismorning.co.uk. The Price of Love by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 7. The Cinema. Part 1. That evening Rachel sat alone in the parlour, reclining on the Chesterfield over the Signal. She had picked up the Signal in order to read about captured burglars, but the paper contained not one word on the subject, or on any other subject except football. The football season had commenced in splendour, and it happened to be the football edition of the Signal that the paper-boy had foisted upon Mrs Maldon's house. Despite repeated and positive assurances from Mrs Maldon that she wanted the late edition and not the football edition on Saturday nights, the football edition was usually delivered, because the paper-boy could not conceive that any customer could sincerely not want the football edition. Rachel was glancing in a torpid condition at the advertisements of the millinery and trimming shops. She would have been more wakeful could she have divined the blow which she had escaped a couple of hours before. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, when she was upstairs in the large bedroom, Mrs Maldon had said to her, "Rachel," and stopped. "Yes, Mrs Maldon," she had replied, and Mrs Maldon had said, "Nothing." Mrs Maldon had desired to say, but in words carefully chosen, "Rachel, I've never told you that Louis Fores began life as a bank clerk and was dismissed for stealing money, and even since then his conduct has not been blameless." Mrs Maldon had stopped because she could not find the form of words which would permit her to impart to her paid companion this information about her grandnephew. Mrs Maldon, when the moment for utterance came, had discovered that she simply could not do it, and all her conscientious regard for Rachel and all her sense of duty were not enough to make her do it. So that Rachel, unsuspectingly, had been spared a tremendous emotional crisis. By this time she had grown nearly accustomed to the fact of the disappearance of the money. She had completely recovered from the hysteria caused by old Batchgrew's attack, and was, indeed, in the supervening calm, very much ashamed of it. She meant to doze, having firmly declined the suggestion of Mrs Tams that she should go to bed at 7 o'clock, and she was just dropping the paper when a tap on the window startled her. She looked in alarm at the window, where the position of one of the blinds proved the correctness of Mrs Maldon's secret theory that if Mrs Maldon did not keep a personal watch on the blinds, they would never be drawn properly. 8 inches of black pane showed, and behind that dark transparency something vague and pale. She knew it must be the hand of Louis Fores that had tapped, and she could feel her heart beating. She flew on tiptoe to the front door and cautiously opened it. At the same time Louis sprang from the narrow space between the street railings and the bow window onto the steps. He raised his hat with the utmost grace. "I saw your head over the arm of the Chesterfield," he said in a cheerful, natural, low voice. "So I tapped on the glass. I thought if I knocked at the door I might waken the old lady. How are things tonight?" In those few words he perfectly explained his manner of announcing himself, endowing it with the highest propriety. Rachel's misgivings were soothed in an instant. Her chief emotion was an ecstatic pride, because he had come, because he could not keep away, because she had known that he would come, that he must come. And in fact, was it not his duty to come? Quietly he came into the hall, quietly she closed the door, and when they were shut up together in the parlour they both spoke in hushed voices, lest the invalid should be disturbed. And was not this, too, highly proper? She gave him the news of the house, and said that Mrs Tams was taking duty in the sick-room till 4 o'clock in the morning, and herself thenceforward, but that the invalid gave no apparent cause for apprehension. "Old Batch been again?" asked Louis, with a complete absence of any constraint. She shook her head. "You'll find that money yet, somewhere, when you're least expecting it," said he, almost gaily. "I'm sure we shall," she agreed with conviction. "And how are you?" His tone became anxious and particular. She blushed deeply, for the outbreak of which she had been guilty and which he had witnessed, then smiled diffidently. "Oh, I'm all right." "You look as if you wanted some fresh air, if you'll excuse me saying so." "I haven't been out today, of course," she said. "Don't you think a walk, just a breath, would do you good?" Without allowing herself to reflect, she answered, "Well, I ought to have gone out long ago to get some food for tomorrow, as it's Sunday. Everything's been so neglected today. If the doctor happened to order a cutlet or anything for Mrs Maldon, I don't know what I should do. Truly, I ought to have thought of it earlier." She seemed to be blaming herself for neglectfulness, and thus the enterprise of going out had the look of an act of duty. Her sensations bewildered her. "Perhaps I could walk down with you and carry parcels. It's a good thing it's Saturday night, or the shops might have been closed." She made no answer to this, but stood up, breathing quickly. "I'll just speak to Mrs Tams." Creeping upstairs, she silently pushed open the door of Mrs Maldon's bedroom. The invalid was asleep. Mrs Tams, her hands crossed in her comfortable lap and her mouth widely open, was also asleep. But Mrs Tams was used to waking with the ease of a dog. Rachel beckoned her to the door. Without a sound the fat woman crossed the room. "I'm just going out to buy a few things we want," said Rachel in her ear, adding no word as to Louis Fores. Mrs. Tams nodded. Rachel went to her bedroom, turned up the gas, straightened her hair, and put on her black hat and her blue jacket trimmed with a nameless fur, and picked up some gloves and her purse. Before descending, she gazed at herself for many seconds in the small slanting glass. Coming downstairs, she took the marketing reticule from its hook in the kitchen passage. Then she went back to the parlour and stood in the doorway, speechless, putting on her gloves rapidly. "Ready?" She nodded. "Shall I?" Louis questioned, indicating the gas. She nodded again, and stretching to his full height, he managed to turn down the gas without employing a footstool, as Rachel was compelled to do. "Wait a moment," she whispered in the hall, when he had opened the front door. These were the first words she had been able to utter. She went to the kitchen for a latchkey. Inserting this latchkey in the keyhole on the outside, and letting Louis pass in front of her, she closed the front door with very careful precautions against noise, and withdrew the key. "I'll take charge of that if you like," said Louis, noticing that she was hesitating where to bestow it. She gave it up to him with a violent thrill. She was intensely happy and intensely fearful. She was only going out to do some shopping, but the door was shut behind her, and at her side was this magic, mysterious being, and the nocturnal universe lay around. Only 24 hours earlier she had shut the door behind her and gone forth to find Louis, and now, having found him, he and she were going forth together like close friends. So much had happened in 24 hours that the previous night seemed to be months away. Part 2. Instead of turning down Friendly Street, they kept straight along the lane till, becoming suddenly urban, it led them across tram lines and Turnhill Road, and so through a gulf or inlet of the market-place behind the shambles, the police office, and the town hall, into the market-place itself, which in these latter years was recovering a little of the commercial prestige snatched from it half a century earlier by St. Luke's Square. Rats now marauded in the empty shops of St. Luke's Square, while the market-place glittered with custom, and the electric decoy of its facades lit up strangely the lower walls of the black and monstrous town hall. Innumerable organized activities were going forward at that moment in the serried buildings of the endless confused streets that stretched up hill and down dale from one end of the Five Towns to the other. Theatres, Empire music halls, Hippodrome music halls, picture palaces in dozens, concerts, sing-songs, spiritualistic propaganda, democratic propaganda, skating rinks, Wild West exhibitions, Dutch auctions, and the private séances in dubious quarters of psychologists, clairvoyants, scientific palmists, and other rascals who sold a foreknowledge of the future for 18p or even a shilling. Viewed under certain aspects, it seemed indeed that the Five Towns, in the week-end desertion of its sordid factories, was reaching out after the higher life, the subtler life, the more elegant life of greater communities. But the little crowds in the little shops of Bursley market-place were nevertheless a proof that a tolerable number of people were still mainly interested in the primitive elemental enterprise of keeping stomachs filled and skins warm, and had no thought beyond it. In Bursley market-place the week's labour was being translated into food and drink and clothing by experts who could distinguish infallibly between 11p, halfpenny, and a shilling. Rachel was such an expert. She forced her thoughts down to the familiar, sane, safe subject of shopping, though tonight her errands were of the simplest description, requiring no brains. But she could not hold her thoughts. A voice was continually whispering to her, not Louis Fores' voice, but a voice within herself that she had never clearly heard before. Alternatively, she scorned it and trembled at it. She stopped in front of the huge window of Wason's Provision Emporium. "Is this the first house of call?" asked Louis airily, swinging the reticule and his stick together. "Well," she hesitated, "Mrs. Tams told me they were selling Singapore pineapple at 7p halfpenny. Mrs. Maldon fancies pineapple. I've known her fancy a bit of pineapple when she wouldn't touch anything else. Yes, there it is." In fact, the whole of the upper half of Wason's window was yellow with tins of preserved pineapple, and great tickets said, "Delicious chunks, 7.5p per large tin. Chunks, 6.5p per large tin." Customers in ones and twos kept entering and leaving the shop. Rachel moved on towards the door, which was at the corner of the cockyard, and looked within. The long double counters were being assailed by a surging multitude who fought for the attention of prestigiatory salesmen. Murmured Rachel. "That may be all very well for Mrs. Tams." A moment later she said, "It's always like that with Wason's shops for the first week or two." And her faintly sarcastic tone of a shrewd housewife immediately set Wason in his place. Wason with his 265 shops, and his racing cars, and his visits to kings and princes. Wason had emporia all over the kingdom, and in particular at Knype, Hanbridge, and Longshore, and now he had penetrated to Bursley, sleepiest of the five. His method was to storm a place by means of electricity, full-page advertisements in newspapers, the power of his mere name, and a leading line or so. At Bursley his leading line was apparently Singapore delicious chunks at 7.5p per large tin. Rachel knew Wason. She had known him at Knype, and she was well aware that his speciality was second-rate. She despised him. She despised that multitude of simpletons who, full of the ancient illusion that somewhere something can regularly be had for nothing, imagined that Wason's bacon and cheese were cheap because he sold preserved pineapple at a penny less than anybody else in the town. And she despised the roaring, vulgar success of advertising and electricity. She had in her some tincture of the old 19th century, which loved the decency of small, quiet things, and in the prim sanity of her judgment upon Wason, she forgot for a few instants that she was in a dream, and that the streets and the whole town appeared strange and troubling to her, and that she scarcely knew what she was doing, and that the most seductive and enchanting of created men was at her side, and very content to be at her side, and also the voice within her was hushed. She said, "I don't see the fun of having the clothes torn off my back to save a penny. I think I shall go to Malkin's. I'll get some cocoa there too. Mrs. Tams simply lives for cocoa." And Louis archly answered, "I've always wondered what Mrs. Tams reminds me of. Now I know. She's exactly like a cocoa tin dented in the middle." She laughed with pleasure, not because she considered the remark in the least witty, but because it was so characteristic of Louis Fores. She wished humbly that she could say things just like that, and with caution she glanced up at him. They went into Ted Malkin's sober shop, where there was a nice handful of customers, in despite of Wason only 5 doors away. And no sooner had Rachel got inside than she was in the dream again, and the voice resumed its monotonous phrase, and she blushed. The swift change took her by surprise and frightened her. She was not in Bursley, but in some forbidden city without a name, pursuing some adventure at once shameful and delicious. A distinct fear seized her. Her self-consciousness was intense. And there was young Ted Malkin in his starched white shirt-sleeves and white apron and black waistcoat and tie, among his cheeses and flitches, every one of which he had personally selected and judged, weighing a piece of cheddar in his honourable copper and brass scales. He was attending to 2 little girls. He nodded with calm benevolence to Rachel and then to Louis Fores. It is true that he lifted his eyebrows, a habit of his, at sight of Fores, but he did so in a quite simple, friendly, and justifiable manner, with no insinuations. "In one moment, Miss Fleckring," said he. And as he rapidly tied up the parcel of cheese and snapped off the stout string with a skilled jerk of the hand, he demanded calmly, "How's Mrs. Maldon to-night?" "Much better," said Rachel, "thank you." And Louis Fores joined easily in, "You may say very much better." "That's rare good news, said Malkin. "I heard you had an anxious night of it. Go across and pay at the other counter, my dears." Then he called out loudly, "1 and 7, please." The little girls tripped importantly away. Yes, indeed, Rachel agreed. The tale of the illness, then, was spread over the town. She was glad, and her self-consciousness somehow decreased. She now fully understood the wisdom of Mrs. Maldon in refusing to let the police be informed of the disappearance of the money. What a fever in the shops of Bursley, even in the quiet shop of Ted Malkin, if the full story got abroad. "And what is it to be to-night, Miss Fleckring? These aren't quite your hours, are they? But I suppose you've been very upset." "Oh," said Rachel, "I only want a large tin of Singapore delicious chunks, please." But if she had announced her intention of spending £1,000 in Ted Malkin's shop, she would not have better pleased him. He beamed. He desired the whole shop to hear that order, for it was the vindication of honest, modest trading, of his father's methods and his own. His father himself, and about a couple of other tradesmen, had steadily fought the fight of the market-place against St. Luke's Square in the day of its glory, and more recently against the powerfully magnetic large shops at Hanbridge, and they had not been defeated. As for Ted Malkin, he was now beyond doubt the best provision dealer and grocer in the town, and had drawn ahead even of Hole's, as it was still called, the one good historic shop left in Luke's Square. The onslaught of Wason had alarmed him, though he had pretended to ignore it, but he was delectably reassured by this heavenly incident of the representative of one of his most distinguished customers coming into the shop and deliberately choosing to buy preserved pineapple from him at 8½d, when it could be got 30 yards away for 7½d. Rachel read his thoughts plainly. She knew well enough that she had done rather a fine thing, and her demeanour showed it. Ted Malkin enveloped the tin in suitable paper. "Sure there's nothing else?" "Not at this counter." He gave her the tin, smiled, and as he turned to the next waiting customer, called out, "Singapore delicious, 8½d." It was rather a poor affair, that tin, a declension from the great days of Mrs. Maldon's married life, when she spent freely, knowing naught of her husband's income except that it was large and elastic. In those days she would buy a real pineapple, entire, once every 3 weeks or so, costing 5, 6, 7, or 8 shillings, gorgeous and spectacular fruit. Now she might have pineapple every day if she chose, but it was not quite the same pineapple. She affected to like it, she did like it, but the difference between the old pineapple and the new was the saddening difference, for Mrs. Maldon's secret heart, between the great days and the paltry, facile convenience of the 20th century. It was to his aunt, who presided over the opposite side of the shop, including the cash desk, that Ted Malkin proclaimed in a loud voice the amounts of purchases on his own side. Miss Malkin was a virgin of 58 years, standing with definite and unchangeable ideas on every subject on earth or in heaven except her own age. As Rachel, followed by Louis Fores, crossed the shop, Miss Malkin looked at them and closed her lips and lowered her eyelids, and the upper part of her body seemed to curve slightly, with the sinuosity of a serpent, a strange, significant movement, sometimes ill described as bridling. The total effect was as though Miss Malkin had suddenly clicked the shutters down on all the windows of her soul, and was spying at Rachel and Louis Fores through a tiny concealed orifice in the region of her eye. It was nothing to Miss Malkin that Rachel, on that night of all nights, had come in to buy Singapore delicious chunks at 8.5d. It was nothing to her that Mrs Maldon had had an attack. Miss Malkin merely saw Rachel and Fores gadding about the town together of a Saturday night while Mrs Maldon was ill in bed, and she regarded Ted's benevolence as the benevolence of a simpleton. Between Miss Malkin's taciturnity and the voice within her, Rachel had a terrible 3 minutes. She was sneaped, which fortunately made her red hair angry, so that she could keep some of her dignity. Louis Fores seemed to be quite unconscious that a fearful scene was enacting between Miss Malkin and Rachel, and he blandly insisted on taking the pineapple tin and the cocoa tin and slipping them into the reticule, as though he had been shopping with Rachel all his life, and there was a perfect understanding between them. The moral effect was very bad. Rachel blushed again. When she emerged from the shop she had the illusion of being breathless, and in the midst of a terrific adventure, the end of which none could foresee. She was furious against Miss Malkin and against herself, yet she indignantly justified herself. Was not Louis Fores Mrs Maldon's nephew, and were not he and she doing the best thing they could together under the difficult circumstances of the old lady's illness? If she was not to co-operate with the old lady's sole relative in Bursley, with whom was she to co-operate? In vain such justifications. She murderously hated Miss Malkin. She said to herself, without meaning it, that no power should induce her ever to enter the shop again. And she thought, I can't possibly go into another shop tonight. I can't possibly do it. And yet I must. Why am I such a silly baby? As they walked slowly along the pavement she was in the wild dream anew, and Louis Fores was her only hope and reliance. She clung to him, though not with her arm. She seemed to know him very intimately, and still he was more enigmatic to her than ever he had been. As for Louis, beneath his tranquil mien of a man of experience and infinite tact, he was undergoing the most extraordinary and delightful sensations, keener even than those which had thrilled him in Rachel's kitchen on the previous evening. The social snob in him had somehow suddenly expired, and he felt intensely the strange charm of going shopping of a Saturday night with a young woman, and making a little purchase here and a little purchase there, and thinking about halfpennies. And in his fancy he built a small house to which he and Rachel would shortly return, and all the brilliant diversions of bachelordom seemed tame and tedious compared to the wondrous existence of this small house. "Now I have to go to Heath's the butcher's," said Rachel, determined at all costs to be a woman and not a silly baby. After that plain announcement her cowardice would have no chance to invent an excuse for not going into another shop, but she added, "And that'll be all." "I know Master Bob Heath. Known him a long time," said Louis Fores, with amusement in his voice, as though to imply that he could relate strange and titillating matters about Heath if he chose, and indeed that he was a mine of secret lore concerning the citizens. The fact was that he had travelled once to war races with the talkative Heath, and that Heath had introduced him to his brother Stanley Heath, a local bookmaker of some reputation, from whom Louis had won £5.10 during the felicitous day. Ever afterwards Bob Heath had effusively saluted Louis on every possible occasion, and had indeed once stopped him in the street and said, "My brother treated you all right, didn't he? Stanley's a true sport." And Louis had to be effusive also. It would never do to be cold to a man from whose brother you had won and received £5.10 on a racecourse. So that when Louis followed Rachel into Heath's shop at the top of Duck Bank, the fat and happy Heath gave him a greeting in which astonishment and warm regard were mingled. The shop was empty of customers, and also it contained little meat, for Heath's was not exactly a Saturday night trade. Bob Heath, clothed from head to foot in slightly blood-stained white, stood behind one hacked counter, and Mrs Heath, similarly attired, and rather stouter, stood behind the other, and each possessed a long steel which hung from an ample loose girdle. Heath, a man of 40, had a salute somewhat military in gesture, though conceived in a softer, more accommodating spirit. He raised his chubby hand to his forehead, but all the muscles of it were lax, and the fingers loosely curved. At the same time he drew back his left foot and kicked up the heel a few inches. Louis amiably responded. Rachel went direct to Mrs Heath, a woman of 45. She had never before seen Heath in the shop. "Doing much with the G's lately, Mr Fores?" Heath inquired in a cheerful, discreet tone. "Not me." "Well, I can't say I've had much luck myself, sir." The conversation was begun in proper form. Through it Louis could hear Rachel buying a cutlet, and then another cutlet from Mrs Heath, and protesting that 5d was a good price, and all she desired to pay even for the finest cutlet in the shop. And then Rachel asked about sweetbreads. Heath's voice grew more and more confidential, and at length, after a brief pause, he whispered, "You're not married, are you, sir? Excuse the liberty." It was a whisper, but one of those terrible miscalculated whispers that can be heard for miles around, like the call of the cuckoo. Plainly Heath was not aware of the identity of Rachel Fleckring, and in his world, which was by no means the world of his shop and his wife, it was incredible that a man should run around shopping with a woman on a Saturday night, unless he was a husband on unescapable duty. Louis shook his head. Mrs Heath called out in severe accents which were a reproof and a warning, "Got a sweetbread, Robert? It's for Mrs Maldon." The clumsy fool understood that he had blundered. He had no sweetbread, not even for Mrs Maldon. The cutlets were wrapped in newspaper, and Louis rather self-consciously opened the more of the reticule for them. "No offence, I hope, sir," said Heath, as the pair left the shop, thus aggravating his blunder. Louis and Rachel crossed Duck Bank in constrained silence. Rachel was scarlet. The new cinema next to the new Congregational Chapel blazed in front of them. "Wouldn't care to look in here, I suppose, would you?" Louis imperturbably suggested. Rachel did not reply. "Only for a quarter of an hour or so," said Louis. Rachel did not venture to glance up at him. She was so agitated that she could scarcely speak. "I don't think so," she muttered. "Why not?" he exquisitely pleaded. "It will do you good." She raised her head and saw the expression of his face, so charming, so provocative, so persuasive. The voice within her was insistent, but she would not listen to it. Nobody had ever looked at her as Louis was looking at her then. The streets, the town, faded. She thought, whatever happens, I cannot withstand that face. She was feverishly happy, and at the same time ravaged by both pain and fear. She became a fatalist. And she abandoned the pretence that she was not the slave of that face. Her eyes grew candidly acquiescent, as if she were murmuring to him, "I am defenceless against you." III. It was not surprising that Rachel, who never in her life had beheld at close quarters any of the phenomena of luxury, should blink her ingenuous eyes at the blinding splendour of the antechambers of the Imperial Cinema de Luxe. Eyes less ingenuous than hers had blinked before that prodigious dazzlement. Even Louis, a man of vast experience and sublime imperturbability, visiting the Imperial on its opening night, had allowed the significant words to escape him, "Well, I'm blessed!" Proof enough of the triumph of the Imperial. The Imperial had set out to be the most gorgeous cinema in the Five Towns, and it simply was. Its advertisements read, "There is always room at the top." There was. Over the ceiling of its foyer, enormous crimson peonies expanded like tropic blooms, and the heart of each peony was a 16-candle-power electric lamp. No other two cinemas in the Five Towns, it was reported, consumed together as much current as the Imperial Deluxe, and nobody could deny that the degree of excellence of a cinema is finally settled by its consumption of electricity. Rachel now understood better the symbolic meaning of the glare in the sky caused at night by the determination of the Imperial to make itself known. She had been brought up to believe that, gas being dear, no opportunity should be lost of turning a jet down, and that electricity was so dear as to be inconceivable in any house not inhabited by crass spendthrift folly. She now saw electricity scattered about as though it were as cheap as salt. She saw written in electric fire across the inner entrance the beautiful sentiment, "Our aim is to please you." The U had 2 lines of fire under it. She saw also the polite nod of the official, dressed not less glitteringly than an admiral of the fleet in full uniform, whose sole duty in life was to welcome and reassure the visitor. All this in Bursley, which even by Knype was deemed an out-of-the-world spot and home of sordid decay. In Hanbridge she would have been less surprised to discover such marvels, because the flaunting modernity of Hanbridge was notorious. And her astonishment would have been milder had she been in the habit of going out at night. Like all those who never went out at night, she had quite failed to keep pace with the advancing stride of the Five Towns on the great road of civilization. More impressive still than the extreme radiance about her was the easy and superb gesture of Louis as, swinging the reticule containing pineapple, cocoa, and cutlets, he slid his hand into his pocket and drew therefrom a coin and smacked it on the wooden ledge of the ticket window, gesture of a man to whom money was naught provided he got the best of everything. "Two," he repeated with slight impatience, bending down so as to see the young woman in white, who sat in another world behind gilt bars. He was paying for Rachel. Exquisite experience for the daughter and sister of Fleckrings, experience unique in her career, and it seemed so right and yet so wondrous that he should pay for her. He picked up the change, and without a glance at them dropped the coins into his pocket. It was a glorious thing to be a man, but was it not even more glorious to be a girl and the object of his princely care? They passed a heavy draped curtain, on which was a large card, "Tea Room." and there seemed to be celestial social possibilities behind that curtain, though indeed it bore another and smaller card, "Closed after 6 o'clock," the result of excessive caution on the part of a Killjoy Town Council. A boy in the likeness of a midshipman took halves of the curving tickets and dropped them into a tin box, and then next Rachel was in a sudden black darkness, studded here and there with minute glowing rubies that revealed the legend "Exit, Exit, Exit." Row after row of dim, pale, intent faces became gradually visible, stretching far back into complete obscurity. Thousands, tens of thousands of faces, it seemed, for the Imperial Deluxe was demonstrating that Saturday night its claim to be the fashionable rage of Bursley. Then mysterious laughter rippled in the gloom, and loud guffaws shot up out of the rippling. Rachel saw nothing whatever to originate this mirth, until an attendant in black with a tiny white apron loomed upon them out of the darkness, and beckoning them forward, bent down and indicated 2 empty places at the end of the row, and the great white scintillating screen of the cinema came into view. Instead of being at the extremity, it was at the beginning of the auditorium, and as Rachel took her seat she saw on the screen, which was scarcely a dozen feet away, a man kneeling at the end of a canal lock and sucking up the water of the canal through a hose pipe, and this astoundingly thirsty man drank with such rapidity that the water, with huge boats floating on it, subsided at the rate of about a foot a second, and the drinker waxed enormously in girth. The laughter grew uproarious. Rachel herself gave a quick, uncontrolled, joyous laugh, and it was as if the laugh had been drawn out of her violently, unawares. Louis Fores also laughed very heartily. "Cute idea that," he whispered. When the film was cut off, Rachel wanted to take back her laugh. She felt a little ashamed of having laughed at anything so silly. "How absurd," she murmured, trying to be serious. Nevertheless, she was in bliss. She surrendered herself to the joy of life, as to a new sensation. She was intoxicated, ravished, bewildered, and quite careless. Perhaps for the first time in her adult existence she lived without reserve or preoccupation, completely in and for the moment. Moreover, the hearty laughter of Louis Fores helped to restore her dignity. If the spectacle was good enough for him, with all his knowledge of the world, to laugh at, she need not blush for its effect on herself. And in another 10 seconds, when the swollen man, staggering along a wide thoroughfare, was run down by an automobile and squashed flat, while streams of water inundated the roadway, she burst again into free laughter, and then looked round at Louis, who at the same instant looked round at her, and they exchanged an intimate, smiling glance. It seemed to Rachel that they were alone and solitary in the crowded interior, and that they shared exactly the same tastes and emotions and comprehended one another profoundly and utterly. Her confidence in him, at that instant, was absolute and enchanting to her. Half a minute later the emaciated man was in a room and being ecstatically kissed by a most beautiful and sweetly shameless girl in a striped shirt-waist. It was a very small room, and the furniture was close upon the couple, giving the scene an air of delightful privacy. And then the scene was blotted out, and gay music rose, lilting from some unseen cave in front of the screen. Rachel was rapturously happy. Gazing along the dim rows, she descried many young couples, without recognizing anybody at all, and most of these couples were absorbed in each other, and some of the girls seemed so elegant and alluring in the dusk of the theatre, and some of the men so fine in their manliness, and the ruby-studded gloom protected them all, including Rachel and Louis, from the audience at large. The screen glowed again, and as it did so Louis gave a start. "By Jove!" he said. "I've left my stick somewhere. It must have been at Heath's. Yes, it was. I put it on the counter while I opened this net thing. Don't you remember? You were taking some money out of your purse." Louis had a very distinct vision of his Rachel's agreeably gloved fingers primly unfastening the purse and choosing a shilling from it. "How annoying!" murmured Rachel feelingly. "I wouldn't lose that stick for a £5 note." He had a marvellous way of saying £5 note. "Would you mind very much if I just slip over and get it, before he shuts? It's only across the road, you know." There was something in the politeness of the phrase "mind very much" that was irresistible to Rachel. It caused her to imagine splendid drawing-rooms far beyond her modest level, and the superlative deportment therein of the well-born. "Not at all," she replied with her best affability. "But will they let you come in again without paying?" "Oh, I'll risk that," he whispered, smiling superiorly. Then he went, leaving the reticule, and she was alone. She rearranged the reticule on the seat by her side. The reticule being already perfectly secure, there was no need for her to touch it, but some nervous movement was necessary to her. Yet she was less self-conscious than she had been with Louis at her elbow. She felt, however, a very slight sense of peril, of the unreality of the plush fauteuil on which she sat, and those rows of vaguely discerned faces on her right, and the reality of distant phenomena such as Mrs Maldon in bed. Notwithstanding her strange and ecstatic experience with Louis Fores that night in the dark romantic town, the problem of the lost money remained, or ought to have remained, as disturbing as ever. To ignore it was not to destroy it. She sat rather tight in her place, increasing her primness, and trying to show by her carriage that she was an adult in full control of all her wise faculties. She set her lips to judge the film with the cold impartiality of middle age, but they persisted in being the fresh, responsive, mobile lips of a young girl. They were saying noiselessly, "He will be back in a minute, and he will find me sitting here just as he left me. When I hear him coming, I shan't turn my head to look. It will be better not." The film showed a forest with a wooden house in the middle of it. Out of this house came a most adorable young woman, who leapt on to a glossy horse and galloped at a terrific rate, plunging down ravines and then trotting fast over the crests of clearings. She came to a man who was boiling a kettle over a campfire, and slipped lithely from the horse, and the man, with a start of surprise, seized her pretty waist and kissed her passionately in the midst of the immense forest whose every leaf was moving. And she returned his kiss without restraint, for they were betrothed. And Rachel imagined the free life of distant forests, where love was, and where slim girls rode mettlesome horses more easily than the girls of the Five Towns rode bicycles. She could not even ride a bicycle, had never had the opportunity to learn. The vision of emotional pleasures that in her narrow existence she had not dreamed of filled her with mild, delightful sorrow. She could conceive nothing more heavenly than to embrace one's true love in the recesses of a forest. Then came crouching Indians, and then she heard Louis Fores behind her. She had not meant to turn round, but when a hand was put heavily on her shoulder, she turned quickly, resenting the contact. "I should like a word with ye, if you can spare a minute, young miss," whispered a voice as heavy as the hand. It was old Thomas Batchgrew's face and whiskers that she was looking up at in the gloom. As if fascinated, she followed in terror those flaunting whiskers up the slope of the narrow aisle to the back of the auditorium. Thomas Batchgrew seemed to be quite at home in the theatre. He wore no hat, and there was a pen behind his ear. Never would she have set foot inside the Imperial Deluxe had she guessed that Thomas Batchgrew was concerned in it. She thought she had heard once, somewhere, that he had to do with cinemas in other parts of the country, but it would not have occurred to her to connect him with a picture palace so near home. She was not alone in her ignorance of the councillor's share in the Imperial. Practically nobody had heard of it until that night, for Batchgrew had come into the new enterprise by the back door of a loan to its promoters, who were richer in ideas than in capital, and now, the harvest being ripe, he was arranging, by methods not unfamiliar to capitalists, to reap where he had not sown. Shame and fear overcame Rachel. The crystal dream was shivered to dust. Awful apprehension, the expectancy of frightful events, succeeded to it. She perceived that since the very moment of quitting the house, the dread of some disaster had been pursuing her, only she had refused to see it. She had found oblivion from it in the new and agitatingly sweet sensations which Louis Fores had procured for her. But now the real was definitely sifted out from the illusory, and nothing but her own daily existence as she had always lived it was real. The rest was a snare. There were no forests, no passionate love, no flying steeds, no splendid adorers for her. She was Rachel Fleckring and none else. Councillor Batchgrew turned to the left, and through a small hole in the painted wall Rachel saw a bright beam shooting out in the shape of a cone, forests and the unreal denizens of forests shimmering across the entire auditorium to impinge on the screen, and she heard the steady rattle of a revolving machine. Then Batchgrew beckoned her into a very small, queerly shaped room, furnished with a table and a chair, and a single electric lamp that hung by a cord from a rough hook in the ceiling. A boy stood near the door, holding 3 tin boxes, one above another in his arms, and keeping the top one in position with his chin. These boxes were similar to that in which Louis' tickets had been dropped. "Did you want your boxes, sir?" asked the boy. "Put them down," Thomas Batchgrew growled. The boy deposited them in haste on the table and hurried out. "How is Mrs Maldon?" demanded Mr. Batchgrew with curtness, after he had snorted and sniffed. He remained standing near to Rachel. "Oh, she's very much better," said Rachel eagerly. "She was asleep when I left." "Have ye left her by herself?" Mr. Batchgrew continued his inquiry. His voice was as offensive as thick dark glue. "Of course not. Mrs. Tams is sitting up with her." Rachel meant her tone to be a dignified reproof to Thomas Batchgrew for daring to assume even the possibility of her having left Mrs. Maldon to solitude, but she did not succeed because she could not manage her tone. She desired intensely to be the self-possessed, mature woman, sure of her position and of her sagacity, but she could be nothing save the absurd, guilty, stammering, blushing little girl, shifting her feet and looking everywhere except boldly into Thomas Batchgrew's horrid eyes. "So it's Mrs. Tams as is sitting with her?" Rachel could not help explaining. "I had to come downtown to do some shopping for Sunday. Somebody had to come. Mr. Fores had called in to ask after Mrs. Maldon, and so he walked down with me." Every word she said appeared intolerably foolish to her as she uttered it. "And then he brought ye in here?" Batchgrew grimly completed the tale. "We came in here for 10 minutes or so, as I'd finished my shopping so quickly. Mr. Fores has just run across to the butcher's to get something that was forgotten." Mr. Batchgrew coughed loosely and loudly, and beyond the cough, beyond the confines of the ugly little room which imprisoned her so close to old Batchgrew and his grotesque whiskers, Rachel could hear the harsh, quick laughter of the audience, and then faint music far off. "If young Fores was here," said Mr. Batchgrew brutally, "I should tell him straight as he might do better than to go gallivanting about the town until that there money's found." He turned towards his boxes. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Batchgrew," said Rachel, tapping her foot and trying to be very dignified. "And I'll tell ye another thing, young miss," Batchgrew went on. "Every minute as ye spend with young Fores you'll regret. He's a bad lot, and ye may as well know it first at last. Ye ought to thank me for telling of ye, but ye won't." "I really don't know what you mean, Mr. Batchgrew." She could not invent another phrase. "You know what I mean right enough, young miss. If you only came in for 10 minutes, your time's up." Rachel moved to leave. "Hold on!" Batchgrew stopped her. There was a change in his voice. "Look at me," he commanded, but with the definite order was mingled some trace of cajolery. She obeyed, quivering, her cheeks the colour of a tomato. In spite of all preoccupations, she distinctly noticed, and not without a curious tremor, that his features had taken on a boyish look. In the almost senile face she could see ambushed the face of the youth that Thomas Batchgrew had been perhaps half a century before. "You're a fine wench," said he, with a note of careless but genuine admiration. "I'll not deny it. Don't you go and throw yourself away. Keep out of mischief." Forgetting all but the last phrase, Rachel marched out of the room, unspeakably humiliated, wounded beyond any expression of her own. The cowardly, odious brute! The horrible ancient! What right had he? What had she done that was wrong, that would not bear the fullest inquiry? The shopping was an absolute necessity. She was obliged to come out. Mrs. Maldon was better and quietly sleeping. Mrs. Tams was the most faithful and capable old person that was ever born. Hence she was justified in leaving the invalid. Louis Fores had offered to go with her. How could she refuse the offer? What reason could there be for refusing it? As for the cinema, who could object to the cinema? Certainly not Thomas Batchgrew. There was no hurry, and she was not an independent woman, earning her own living. Who on earth had the right to dictate to her? She was not a slave. Even a servant had an evening out once a week. She was sinless. And yet while she was thus ardently defending herself, she knew well that she had sinned against the supreme social law, the law of the look of things. It was true that chance had worked against her, but common sense would have rendered chance powerless by giving it no opportunity to be malevolent. She was furious with Rachel Fleckring. That Rachel Fleckring, of all mortal girls, should have exposed herself to so dreadful, so unforgettable a humiliation was mortifying in the very highest degree. Her lips trembled. She was about to burst into a sob. But at this moment the rattle of the revolving machine behind the hole ceased, the theatre blazed from end to end with sudden light, the music resumed, and a number of variegated advertisements were weakly thrown on the screen. She set herself doggedly to walk back down the slope of the aisle, not daring to look ahead for Louis. She felt that every eye was fixed on her with base curiosity. When, after the endless ordeal of the aisle, she reached her place, Louis was not there, and though she was glad, she took offence at his delay. Gathering up the reticule with a nervous sweep of the hand, she departed from the theatre, her eyes full of tears. And amid all the wild confusion in her brain, one little thought flashed clear and was gone: the wastefulness of paying for a whole night's entertainment and then only getting 10 minutes out of it. IV. She met Louis Fores high up Byker's Lane, about 100 yards below Mrs. Maldon's house. She saw someone come out of the gate of the house, and heard the gate clang in the distance. For a moment she could not surely identify the figure, but as soon as Louis, approaching and carrying his stick, grew unmistakable even in the darkness, all her agitation, which had been subsiding under the influence of physical exercise, rose again to its original fever. "Ah!" said Louis, greeting her with a most deferential salute. "There you are! I was really beginning to wonder. I opened the front door, but there was no light and no sound, so I shut it again and came back. What happened to you?" His ingenuous and delightful face, so confident, good-natured, and respectful, had exactly the same effect on her as before. At the sight of it, Thomas Batchgrew's vague accusation against Louis was dismissed utterly as the rancorous malice of an evil old man. For the rest, she had never given it any real credit, having an immense trust in her own judgment. But she had no intention of letting Louis go free. As she had been put in the wrong, so must he be put in the wrong. This seemed to her only just. Besides, was he not wholly to blame? Also, she remembered with strange clearness the admiration in the mien of the hated Batchgrew, and the memory gave her confidence. She said, with an effort, after chilly detachment, "I couldn't wait in the cinema alone for ever." He was perturbed. "But I assure you," he said nicely, "I was as quick as ever I could be. Heath had put my stick in his back parlour to keep it safe for me, and it was quite a business finding it again. Why didn't you wait? I say, I hope you weren't vexed at my leaving you." "Of course I wasn't vexed," she answered with heat. "Didn't I tell you I didn't mind? But if you want to know, old Batchgrew came along while you were gone and insulted me." "Insulted you? How? What was he doing there?" "How should I know what he was doing there? Better ask him questions like that. All I can tell you is that he came to me and called me into a room at the back and told me I'd no business to be there, nor you either, while Mrs. Maldon was ill in bed." "Silly old fool! I hope you didn't take any notice of him." "Yes, that's all very fine, that is. It's easy for you to talk like that, but well, I suppose there's nothing more to be said." She moved to one side. Her anger was rising. She knew that it was rising. She was determined that it should rise. She did not care. She rather enjoyed the excitement. She smarted under her recent experience. She was deeply miserable, and yet at the same time, standing there close to Louis in the rustling night, she was exultant as she certainly had never been exultant before. She walked forward grimly. Louis turned and followed her. "I'm most frightfully sorry," he said. She replied fiercely, "It isn't as if I didn't wait. I waited in the porch I don't know how long. Then, of course, I came home as there was no sign of you. When I went back you weren't there. It must have been while you were with old Batch, so I naturally didn't stay. I just came straight up here. And I was afraid you were vexed because I'd left you alone." "Well, and if I was," said Rachel, splendidly contradicting herself, "it's not a very nice thing for a girl to be left alone like that, and all on account of a stick." There was a break in her voice. Arrived at the gate, she pushed it open. "Good night," she snapped. "Please don't come in." And within the gate she deliberately stared at him with an unforgiving gaze. The impartial lamp-post lit the scene. "Good night," she repeated harshly. She was saying to herself, "He really does take it in the most beautiful way. I could do anything I liked with him." "Good night," said Louis, with strict punctilio. When she got to the top of the steps she remembered that Louis had the latchkey. He was gone. She gave a wet sob and impulsively ran down the steps and opened the gate. Louis returned. She tried to speak and could not. "I beg your pardon," said Louis. "Of course you want the key." He handed her the key with a gesture that disconcertingly melted the rigour of all her limbs. She snatched at it and plunged for the gate just as the tears rolled down her cheeks in a shower. The noise of the gate covered a fresh sob. She did not look back. Amid all her quite real distress she was proud and happy, proud because she was old enough and independent enough and audacious enough to quarrel with her lover, and happy because she had suddenly discovered life, and the soft darkness and the wind and the faint sky reflections of distant furnace fires, and the sense of the road winding upward, and the very sense of the black mass of the house in front of her, dimly lit at the upper floor, all made part of her mysterious happiness. End of chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Christine Blashford, www.wokeupthismorning.co.uk. The Price of Love by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 8. End and Beginning. Part 1. "Mrs. Tams," said Mrs. Maldon in a low, alarmed, and urgent voice. The gas was turned down in the bedroom, and Mrs. Maldon, looking from her bed across the chamber, could only just distinguish the stout, vague form of the charwoman asleep in an armchair. The light from the street lamp was strong enough to throw faint shadows of the window frames on the blinds. The sleeper did not stir. Mrs. Maldon summoned again, more loudly, "Mrs. Tams!" And Mrs. Tams, starting out of another world, replied with deprecation, "Hey, hey!" as if saying, "I am here. I am fully awake and observant. Please remain calm." Mrs. Maldon said agitatedly, "I've just heard the front door open. I'm sure whoever it was trying not to make a noise. There! Can't you hear anything?" "That I canna," said Mrs. Tams. "No," Mrs. Maldon protested, as Mrs. Tams approached the gas to raise it. "Don't touch the gas. If anybody's got in, let them think we're asleep." The mystery of the vanished money and the fear of assassins seemed suddenly to oppress the very air of the room. Mrs. Maldon was leaning on one elbow in her bed. Mrs. Tams said to her in a whisper, "I mun go see." "Please don't," Mrs. Maldon entreated. "I mun go see," said Mrs. Tams. She was afraid, but she conceived that she ought to examine the house, and no fear could have stopped her from going forth into the zone of danger. The next moment she gave a short laugh, and said in her ordinary tone, "Bless us, I shall be forgetting the nose on my face next. It's Miss Rachel coming in, of course." "Miss Rachel coming in," repeated Mrs. Maldon. "Has she been out? I was not aware. She said nothing. Her came up a bit since and said I had to do some shopping." "Shopping? At this time of night?" murmured Mrs. Maldon. Said Mrs. Tams laconically, "To-morrow's Sunday, and pray God you'll fancy a bite of summat tasty." While the two old women, equalized in rank by the fact of Mrs. Maldon's illness, by the sudden alarm, and by the darkness of the room, were thus conversing, sounds came from the pavement through the slightly open windows, voices, and the squeak of the gate roughly pushed open. "That's Miss Rachel now," said Mrs. Tams. "Then who was it came in before?" Mrs. Maldon demanded. There was the tread of rapid feet on the stone steps, and then the gate squeaked. Mrs. Tams went to the window and pulled aside the blind. "Aye," she announced simply, "it's Miss Rachel and Mr. Fores." Mrs. Maldon caught her breath. "You didn't tell me she was out with Mr. Fores," said Mrs. Maldon, stiffly but weakly. "It's first I knew of it," Mrs. Tams replied, still spying over the pavement. "He's given her the key. There! He's gone." Mrs. Maldon muttered, "The key? What key?" "The latch key, belike." "I must speak to Miss Rachel," breathed Mrs. Maldon in a voice of extreme and painful apprehension. The front door closing sent a vibration through the bedroom. Mrs. Tarns hesitated an instant, and then raised the gas. Mrs. Maldon lay with shut eyes on her left side, and gave no sign of consciousness. Light footsteps could be heard on the stairs. "I'll go see," said Mrs. Tams. In the heart of the aged woman exanimate on the bed, and in the heart of the ageing woman whose stout, coarse arm was still raised to the gas tap, were the same sentiments of wonder, envy, and pity, aroused by the enigmatic actions of a younger generation going its perilous instinctive ways to keep the race alive. Mrs. Tams lit a benzoline hand lamp at the gas, and silently left the bedroom. She still somewhat feared an unlawful invader, but the arrival of Rachel had reassured her. Preceded by the waving little flame, she passed Rachel's door, which was closed, and went downstairs. Every mysterious room on the ground floor was in order and empty. No sign of an invasion. Through the window of the kitchen she saw the fresh cutlets under a wire cover in the scullery, and on the kitchen table were the tin of pineapple and the tin of cocoa, with the reticule near by. All the doors that ought to be fastened were fastened. She remounted the stairs and blew out the lamp on the threshold of the mistress's bedroom, and as she did so she could hear Rachel winding up her alarm clock in quick jerks, and the light shone bright like a silver rod under Rachel's door. "Her's gone reet to bed," said Mrs. Tams softly, by the bedside of Mrs. Maldon. "You've no cause for to worry yourself. I've looked over the house." Mrs. Maldon was fast asleep. Mrs. Tams lowered the gas and resumed her chair, and the street lamp once more threw the shadows of the window frames on the blinds. II. The next day Mrs. Tams, who had been appointed to sleep in the spare room, had to exist under the blight of Rachel's chill disapproval because she had not slept in the spare room, nor in any bed at all. The arrangement had been that Mrs. Tams should retire at 4 a.m., Rachel taking her place with Mrs. Maldon. Mrs. Tams had not retired at 4 a.m. because Rachel had not taken her place. As a fact, Rachel had been wakened by a bang of the front door at 10:30 a.m. only. Her first glance at the alarm clock on her dressing table was incredulous, and she refused absolutely to believe that the hour was so late. Yet the alarm clock was giving its usual sturdy, noisy tick, and the sun was high. Then she refused to believe that the alarm had gone off, and in order to remain firm in her belief she refrained from any testing of the mechanism which might, indeed would, have proved that the alarm had in fact gone off. It became with her an article of dogma that on that particular morning, of all mornings, the very reliable alarm clock had failed in its duty. The truth was that she had lain awake till nearly 3 o'clock, turning from side to side, and thinking bitterly upon the imperfections of human nature, and had then fallen into a deep, invigorating sleep, from which perhaps half a dozen alarm clocks might not have roused her. She arose full of health and anger, and in a few minutes she was out of the bedroom, for she had not fully undressed. Like many women, when there was watching to be done, she loved to keep her armour on, and to feel the exciting strain of the unusual in every movement. She fell on Mrs. Tams as Mrs. Tams was coming upstairs after letting out the doctor, and refreshing herself with cocoa in the kitchen. A careless observer might have thought from their respective attitudes that it was Mrs. Tams and not Rachel who had overslept herself. Rachel divided the blame between the alarm clock and Mrs. Tams for not wakening her. Indeed, she seemed to consider herself the victim of a conspiracy between Mrs. Tams and the alarm clock. She explicitly blamed Mrs. Tams for allowing the doctor to come and go without her knowledge. Even the doctor did not get off scot-free, for he ought to have asked for Rachel and insisted on seeing her. She examined Mrs. Tams about the invalid's health as a lawyer examines a hostile witness, and when Mrs. Tams said that the invalid had slept, and was sleeping, stertorously in an unaccountable manner, and hinted that the doctor was not undisturbed by the new symptom, and meant to call again later on, Rachel's tight-lipped mien indicated that this might not have occurred if only Mrs. Tams had fulfilled her obvious duty of wakening Rachel. Though she was hungry, she scornfully repulsed the suggestion of breakfast. Mrs. Tams, thoroughly accustomed to such behaviour in the mighty, accepted it as she accepted the weather. But if she had had to live through the night again, after all a quite tolerable night, she would still not have wakened Rachel at 4 a.m. Rachel softened as the day passed. She ate a good dinner at 1 o'clock, with Mrs. Tams in the kitchen, one or the other mounting at short intervals to see if Mrs. Maldon had stirred. Then she changed into her second-best frock, in anticipation of the doctor's Sunday afternoon visit, strictly commanded Mrs. Tams, but with relenting kindness in her voice, to go and lie down, and established herself neatly in the sick-room. Though her breathing had become noiseless again, Mrs. Maldon still slept. She had wakened only once since the previous night. She lay calm and dignified in slumber, an old and devastated woman, with that disconcerting resemblance to a corpse shown by all aged people asleep, but yet with little sign of positive illness save the slight distortion of her features caused by the original attack. Rachel sat idle, prim, in vague reflection, at intervals smoothing her petticoat, or giving a faint cough, or gazing at the mild blue September sky. She might have been reading a book, but she was not by choice a reader. She had the rare capacity of merely existing. Her thoughts flitted to and fro, now resting on Mrs. Maldon with solemnity, now on Mrs. Tams with amused benevolence, now on old Batchgrew with lofty disgust, and now on Louis Fores with unquiet curiosity and delicious apprehension. She gave a little shudder of fright and instantly controlled it. Mrs. Maldon, instead of being asleep, was looking at her. She rose and went to the bedside and stood over the sick woman by the pillow, benignly, asking with her eyes what desire of the sufferer's she might fulfil. And Mrs. Maldon looked up at her with another benignity, and they both smiled. "You've slept very well," said Rachel softly. Mrs. Maldon, continuing to smile, gave a scarcely perceptible affirmative movement of the head. "Will you have some of your Revalenta? I've only got to warm it here. Everything's ready." "Nothing, thank you, dear," said Mrs. Maldon in a firm, matter-of-fact voice. The doctor had left word that food was not to be forced on her. "Do you feel better?" Mrs. Maldon answered in a peculiar tone. "My dear, I shall never feel any better than I do now." "Oh, you mustn't talk like that," said Rachel in gay protest. "I want to talk to you, Rachel," said Mrs. Maldon, once more reassuringly matter-of-fact. "Sit down there." Rachel obediently perched herself on the bed and bent her head, and her face, which was now much closer to Mrs. Maldon's, expressed the gravity which Mrs. Maldon would wish, and also the affectionate condescension of youth towards age, and of health towards infirmity, and as almost unconsciously she exulted in her own youth and strength, delicate little poniards of tragic grief for Mrs. Maldon's helpless and withered senility seemed to stab through that personal pride. The shiny, veined right hand of the old woman emerged from under the bedclothes and closed with hot, fragile grasp on Rachel's hand. Within the impeccable orderliness of the bedroom was silence, and beyond was the vast Sunday afternoon silence of the district, producing the sensation of surcease, recreating the impressive illusion of religion, even out of that brutish irreligion that was bewailed from pulpits to empty pews in all the temples of all the 5 towns. Only the smoke waving slowly through the clean-washed sky from a few high chimneys over miles of deserted manufactories made a link between Saturday and Monday. "I've something I want to say to you," said Mrs. Maldon in that deceptive matter-of-fact voice. "I wanted to tell you yesterday afternoon, but I couldn't. And then again last night, but I went off to sleep." "Yes," murmured Rachel, duped by Mrs. Maldon's manner into perfect security. She was thinking, "What's the poor old thing got into her head now? Is it something fresh about the money?" "It's about yourself," said Mrs. Maldon. Rachel exclaimed impulsively, "What about me?" She could feel a faint vibration in Mrs. Maldon's hand. "I want you not to see so much of Louis." Rachel was shocked and insulted. She straightened her spine and threw back her head sharply, but she dared not by force withdraw her hand from Mrs. Maldon's. Moreover, Mrs. Maldon's clasp tightened almost convulsively. "I suppose Mr. Batchgrew's been up here telling tales while I was asleep," Rachel expostulated, hotly, and her demeanour was at once pouting, sulky, and righteously offended. Mrs. Maldon was puzzled. "This morning, do you mean, dear?" she asked. Tears stood in Rachel's eyes. She could not speak, but she nodded her head, and then another sentence burst from her full breast. "And you told Mrs. Tams she wasn't to tell me Mr. Batchgrew'd called." "I've not seen or heard anything of Mr. Batchgrew," said Mrs. Maldon, "but I did hear you and Louis talking outside last night." The information startled Rachel. "Well, and what if you did, Mrs. Maldon?" she defended herself. Her foot tapped on the floor. She was obliged to defend herself, and with care. Mrs. Maldon's tranquillity, self-control, immense age and experience, superior deportment, extreme weakness, and the respect which she inspired, compelled the girl to intrench warily, instead of carrying off the scene in one stormy outburst of resentment, as theoretically she might have done. Mrs. Maldon said cajolingly, flatteringly, "My dear, do be your sensible self and listen to me." It then occurred to Rachel that during the last day or so, the period seemed infinitely longer, she had been losing, not her common sense, but her immediate command of that faculty, of which she was privately very proud. And she braced her being, reaching up towards her own conception of herself, towards the old invulnerable Rachel Louisa Fleckring. At any cost she must keep her reputation for common sense with Mrs. Maldon. And so she set a watch on her gestures and moderated her voice, secretly yielding to the benevolence of the old lady, and said in the tone of a wise and kind woman of the world and an incarnation of profound sagacity, "What do I see of Mr. Fores, Mrs. Maldon? I see nothing of Mr. Fores, or hardly. I'm your lady help, and he's your nephew, at least he's your great-nephew, and it's your house he comes to. I can't help being in the house, can I? If you're thinking about last night, well, Mr. Forres called to see how you were getting on, and I was just going out to do some shopping. He walked down with me. I suppose I needn't tell you I didn't ask him to walk down with me. He asked me. I couldn't hardly say no, could I? And there were some parcels, and he walked back with me." She felt so wise and so clever, and the narrative seemed so entirely natural, proper, and inevitable that she was tempted to continue. "And supposing we did go into a cinematograph for a minute or two, what then?" But she had no courage for the confession. As a wise woman, she perceived the advisability of letting well alone. Moreover, she hated confessions, remorse, and gnashing of teeth. And Mrs. Maldon regarded her worldly and mature air, with its touch of polite condescension, as both comic and tragic, and thought sadly of all the girl would have to go through before the air of mature worldliness which she was now affecting could become natural to her. "My dear," said Mrs. Maldon, "I have perfect confidence in you." It was not quite true, because Rachel's protest as to Mr. Batchgrew, seeming to point to strange concealed incidents, had most certainly impaired the perfection of Mrs. Maldon's confidence in Rachel. Rachel considered that she ought to pursue her advantage, and in a voice light and yet firm, good-natured and yet restive, she said, "I really don't think anybody has the right to talk to me about Mr. Forres. No, truly, I don't." "You mustn't misunderstand me, Rachel," Mrs. Maldon replied, and her other hand crept out and stroked Rachel's captive hand. "I am only saying to you what it is my duty to say to you, or to any other young woman that comes to live in my house. You're a young woman, and Louis is a young man. I'm making no complaint, but it's my duty to warn you against my nephew." "But, Mrs. Maldon, I didn't know either him or you a month ago." Mrs. Maldon, ignoring the interruption, proceeded quietly, "My nephew is not to be trusted." Her aged face slowly flushed, as in that single brief sentence she overthrew the grand principle of a lifetime. She, who never spoke ill of anybody, had spoken ill of one of her own family. "But—" Rachel stopped. She was frightened by the appearance of the flush on those devastated yellow cheeks, and by a quiver in the feeble voice and in the clasping hand. She could divine the ordeal which Mrs. Maldon had set herself, and through which she had passed. Mrs. Maldon carried conviction, and in so doing she inspired awe. And on the top of all, Rachel felt profoundly and exquisitely flattered by the immolation of Mrs. Maldon's pride. "The money, it has something to do with that," thought Rachel. "My nephew is not to be trusted," said Mrs. Maldon again. "I know all his good points, but the woman who married him would suffer horribly, horribly." "I'm so sorry you've had to say this," said Rachel very kindly, "but I assure you that there's nothing at all, nothing whatever, between Mr. Forres and me." And in that instant she genuinely believed that there was not. She accepted Mrs. Maldon's estimate of Louis, and further, and perhaps illogically, she had the feeling of having escaped from a fatal danger. She expected Mrs. Maldon to agree eagerly that there was nothing between herself and Louis, and to reiterate her perfect confidence. But instead, Mrs. Maldon, apparently treating Rachel's assurance as negligible, continued with an added solemnity, "I shall only live a little while longer, a very little while." The contrast between this and her buoyant announcement on the previous day that she was not going to die just yet was highly disturbing, but Rachel could not protest or even speak. "A very little while," repeated Mrs. Maldon reflectively. "I've not known you long, as you say, Rachel, but I've never seen a girl I liked more, if you don't mind me telling you. I've never seen a girl I thought better of. And I don't think I could die in peace if I thought Louis was going to cause you any trouble after I'm gone. No, I couldn't die in peace if I thought that." And Rachel, intimately moved, thought, "She has saved me from something dreadful," without trying to realize precisely from what. How splendid she is! And she cast out from her mind all the multitudinous images of Louis Forres that were there, and full of affection and flattered pride and gratitude and childlike admiration, she bent down and rewarded the old woman who had so confided in her with a priceless girlish kiss, and she had the sensation of beginning a new life. III. And yet, a few moments later, when Mrs. Maldon faintly murmured, "Someone at the front door," Rachel grew at once uneasy, and the new life seemed an illusion, either too fine to be true or too leaden to be desired, and she was swaying amid uncertainties. Perhaps Louis was at the front door. He had not yet called, but surely he was bound to call some time during the day. Of the dozen different Rachels in Rachel, one adventurously hoped that he would come, and another feared that he would come. One ruled him sharply out of the catalogue of right-minded persons, and another was ready passionately to defend him. "I think not," said Rachel. "Yes, dear, I heard someone," Mrs. Maldon insisted. Mrs. Maldon, long practised in reconstructing the life of the street from trifling hints of sound heard in bed, was not mistaken. Rachel, opening the door of the bedroom, caught the last tinkling of the front door bell below. On the other side of the front door somebody was standing, Louis Forres or another. "It may be the doctor," she said brightly as she left the bedroom. The coward in her wanted it to be the doctor. But descending the stairs she could see plainly through the glass that Louis himself was at the front door. The Rachel that feared was instantly uppermost in her. She was conscious of dread. From the breathless sinking within her bosom the stairs might have been the deck of a steamer pitching in a heavy sea. She thought, Here is the Louis to whom I am indifferent. There is nothing between us, really, but shall I have the strength to open the door to him?" She opened the door, with the feeling that the act was tremendous and irrevocable. The street, in the sabbatic sunshine, was as calm as at midnight. Louis Fores, stiff and constrained, stood strangely against the background of it. The unusualness of his demeanour, which was plain to the merest glance, increased Rachel's agitation. It appeared to Rachel that the two of them faced each other like wary enemies. She tried to examine his face in the light of Mrs. Maldon's warning, as though it were the face of a stranger, but without much success. "Is Auntie well enough for me to see her?" asked Louis, without greeting or preliminary of any sort. His voice was imperfectly under control. Rachel replied curtly, "I dare say she is." To herself she said, "Of course, if he's going to sulk about last night, well, he must sulk. Really and truly he got much less than he deserved. He had no business at all to have suggested me going to the cinematograph with him. The longer he sulks, the better I shall be pleased." And in fact she was relieved at his sullenness. She tossed her proud head, but with primness. And she fervently credited to the full Mrs. Maldon's solemn insinuations against the disturber. Louis hesitated a second, then stepped in. Rachel marched processionally upstairs, and with the detachment of a footman announced to Mrs. Maldon that Mr. Fores waited below. "Oh, please bring him up," said Mrs. Maldon, with a mild and casual benevolence that surprised the girl, for Rachel, in the righteous ferocity of her years, vaguely thought that an adverse moral verdict ought to be swiftly followed by something in the nature of annihilation. "Will you please come up?" she invited Louis from the head of the stairs, adding privately, "I can be as stiff as you can, and stiffer. How mistaken I was in you!" She preceded him into the bedroom, and then with ostentatious formality left aunt and nephew together. Nobody should ever say any more that she encouraged the attentions of Louis Fores. "What is the matter, dear?" Mrs. Maldon inquired from her bed, perceiving the signs of emotion on Louis's face. "Has Mr. Batchgrew been here yet?" Louis demanded. "No. Is he coming?" "Yes, he's just been to my digs. Came in his car. Auntie, do you know that he's accusing me of stealing your money and all sorts of things? I don't want to hide anything from you. It's true I was with Rachel at the cinematograph last night, but—" Mrs. Maldon raised her enfeebled, shaking hand. "Louis!" she entreated. His troubled, ingenuous face seemed to torture her. "I know it's a shame to bother you, Auntie, but what was I to do? He's coming up here. I only want to tell you I've not got your money. I've not stolen it. I'm absolutely innocent. Absolutely. And I'll swear it on anything you like." His voice almost broke under the strain of its own earnestness. His plaintive eyes invoked justice and protection. Who could have doubted that he was sincere in this passionate, wistful protestation of innocence? "Louis!" Mrs. Maldon entreated again, committing herself to naught, taking no side, but finding shelter beneath the enigmatic, appealing repetition of his name. It was the final triumph of age over crude youth. "Louis!" IV. Rachel stood expectant and watchful in the kitchen. She was now filled with dread. She wanted to go up and waken Mrs. Tams, but was too proud. The thought had come into her mind, "His coming like this has something to do with the money. Perhaps he wasn't sulking with me after all. Perhaps—" But what it was that she dreaded she could not have defined. And then she caught the sound of an approaching automobile. The car threw its shadow across the glazed front door, which she commanded from the kitchen, and stopped. And the front door bell rang uncannily over her head. She opened the door to Councillor Batchgrew, whose breathing was irregular and rapid. "Has Louis Fores been here?" Batchgrew asked. "He's upstairs now with Mrs. Maldon." Without warning, Thomas Batchgrew strode into the house and straight upstairs. His long whiskers sailed round the turn of the stairs and disappeared. Rachel was somewhat discomfited and very resentful, but her dread was not thereby diminished. "They'll kill the old lady between them if they don't take care," she thought. The next instant Louis appeared at the head of the stairs. With astounding celerity Rachel slipped into the parlour. She could not bear to encounter him in the lobby. It was too narrow. She heard Louis come down the stairs, saw him take his hat from the oak chest, and heard him open the front gate. In the lobby he had looked neither to right nor left. "How do, Ernest?" she heard him greet the amateur chauffeur-in-chief of the Batchgrew family. His footfalls on the pavement died away from the general silence of the street. Overhead she could hear old Batchgrew walking to and fro. Without reflection, she went upstairs and hovered near the door of Mrs. Maldon's bedroom. She said to herself that she was not eavesdropping. She listened while pretending not to listen, but there was no sign of conversation within the room. And then she very distinctly heard old Batchgrew exclaim, "And they go gallivanting off together to the cinema!" Upon which ensued another silence. Rachel flushed with shame, fury, and apprehension. She hated Batchgrew and Louis and all gross masculine invaders. The mysterious silence within the room persisted, and then old Batchgrew violently opened the door and glared at Rachel. He showed no surprise at seeing her there on the landing. "You'd better keep an eye on Mrs.," he said gruffly. "She's gone to sleep, seemingly." And with no other word he departed. Before the car had given its warning hoot, Rachel was at Mrs. Maldon's side. The old lady lay in all tranquillity on her left arm. She was indeed asleep, or she was in a stupor, and the peculiar stertorous noise of her breathing had recommenced. Rachel's vague dread vanished as she gazed at the worn features, and gave place to a new and definite fright. "They have killed her!" she muttered, and she ran into the next room and called Mrs. Tams. "Who's below?" asked Mrs. Tams as, wide awake, she came out onto the landing. "Nobody," said Rachel. "They've gone." But the doctor was below. Mr. Batchgrew had left the front door open. "What a good thing!" cried Rachel. In the bedroom, Dr. Yardley, speaking with normal loudness, just as though Mrs. Maldon had not been present, said to Rachel, "I expected this morning. There's nothing to be done. If you try to give her food, she'll only get it into the lung. It's very improbable that she'll regain consciousness." "But are you sure, doctor?" Rachel asked. The doctor answered grimly, "No, I'm not. I'm never sure. She may recover." "She's been rather disturbed this afternoon." The doctor lifted his shoulders. "That's got nothing to do with it," said he. "As I told you, she's had an embolus in one artery of the brain. It lessened at first for a bit, they do sometimes, and now it's enlarging, that's all. Nothing external could affect it either way." "But how long?" asked Rachel, recoiling. V. Her chief sensation that evening was that she was alone, for Mrs. Tams was not a companion, but a slave. She was alone with a grave and strange responsibility which she could not evade. Indeed, events had occurred in such a manner as to make her responsibility seem natural and inevitable, to give it the sanction of the most correct convention. Between 4:30 and 6 in the afternoon 4 separate calls of inquiry had been made at the house, thus demonstrating Mrs. Maldon's status in the town. One lady had left a fine bunch of grapes. To all these visitors Rachel had said the same things, namely, that Mrs. Maldon had been better on the Saturday, but was worse, that the case was very serious, that the doctor had been twice that day and was coming again, that Councillor Batchgrew was fully informed and had seen the patient, that Mr. Louis Fores, Mrs. Maldon's only near relative in England, was constantly in and out, that she herself had the assistance of Mrs. Tams, who was thoroughly capable, and that, while she was much obliged for offers of help, she could think of no way of utilizing them. So that when the door closed on the last of the callers, Rachel, who a month earlier had never even seen Mrs. Maldon, was left in sole rightful charge of the dying bed. And there was no escape for her. She could not telegraph, the day being Sunday. Moreover, except Thomas Batchgrew, there was nobody to whom she might telegraph. And she did not want Mr. Batchgrew. Though Mr. Batchgrew certainly had not guessed the relapse, she felt no desire whatever to let him have news. She hated his blundering intrusions, and in spite of the doctor's statements she would insist to herself that he and Louis between them had somehow brought about the change in Mrs. Maldon. Of course she might fetch Louis. She did not know his exact address, but he could be discovered. At any rate, Mrs. Tams might be sent for him, but she could not bring herself to make any advance towards Louis. At a little after 6 o'clock, when the rare chapel-goers had ceased to pass, and the still rarer church-goers were beginning to respond to distant bells, Mrs. Tams informed her that tea was ready for her in the parlour, and she descended and took tea utterly alone. Mrs. Tams had lighted the fire, and had moved the table comfortably towards the fire, act of astounding initiative and courage, in itself a dramatic proof that Mrs. Maldon no longer reigned at Bycars. Tea finished, Rachel returned to the sick-room, where there was nothing whatever to do except watch the minutes recede. She thought of her father and brother in America. Then Mrs. Tams, who had been clearing away the tea things, came into the bedroom and said, "Here's Mr. Fores, miss." Rachel started. "Mr. Fores? What does he want?" she asked querulously. Mrs. Tams preserved her blandness. "He asked for you, miss." "Didn't he ask how Mrs. Maldon is?" "No, miss." "Well, I don't want to see him. You might run down and tell him what the doctor said, Mrs. Tams." She tried to make her voice casually persuasive. "Shall I, miss?" said Mrs. Tams doubtfully, and turned to the door. Rachel was again full of fear and resentment. Louis had committed the infamy of luring her into the cinematograph. It was through him that she had got herself talked about. Mrs. Maldon's last words had been a warning against him. He and Mr. Batchgrew had desecrated the sick-room with their mysterious visitations. And now Louis was come again. From what catastrophes had not Mrs. Maldon's warning saved her? "Here, I'll go," said Rachel in a sudden resolve. "I'm glad on it," said Mrs. Tams simply. In the parlour Louis stood in front of the fire. Although the blinds were drawn, the gas had not been lit, but the fire and the powerful street lamp together sufficed to give clearness to every object in the room. The table had been restored to its proper situation. The gift of grapes ornamented the sideboard. "Good evening," said Rachel sullenly, as if pouting. She avoided looking at Louis, and sat down on the Chesterfield. Louis broke forth in a cascade of words. "I say, I'm most awfully sorry. I hadn't the faintest notion this afternoon she was any worse. Not the faintest. Otherwise I shouldn't have dreamt... I met the doctor just now in Moorthorne Road, and he told me." "What did he tell you?" asked Rachel, still with averted head, picking at her frock. "Well, he gave me to understand there's very little hope, and nothing to be done. If I'd had the faintest notion..." "You needn't worry about that," said Rachel. "Your coming made no difference. The doctor said so." And she asked herself why she should go out of her way to reassure Louis. It would serve him right to think that his brusque visit with Mr. Batchgrew's was the origin of the relapse. "Is there any change?" Louis asked. Rachel shook her head. "No," she said. "We just have to sit and watch." "Doctor's coming in again tonight, isn't he?" Rachel nodded. "It seems it's an embolus." Rachel nodded once more. She had still no conception of what an embolus was, but she naturally assumed that Louis could define an embolus with exactitude. "I say," said Louis, and his voice was suddenly charged with magical qualities of persuasion, entreaty, and sincerity. "I say, you might look at me." She flushed, but she looked up at him. She might have sat straight and remarked, "Mr. Fores, what do you mean by talking to me like that?" But she raised her eyes and her crimson cheeks for one timid instant, and dropped them. His voice had overcome her. With a single phrase, with a mere inflection, he had changed the key of the interview, and the glance at him had exposed her to the appeal of his face, more powerful than 10,000 logical arguments and warnings. His face proved that he was a sympathetic, wistful, worried fellow creature, and miraculously, uniquely handsome. His face in the twilight was the most romantic face that Rachel had ever seen. His gestures had a celestial charm. He said, "I know I ought to apologize for the way I came in this afternoon. I do. But if you knew what cause I had, would you believe that old Batch had come to my place and practically accused me of stealing the old lady's money? Stealing it!" "Never!" Rachel murmured. "Yes, he did. The fact is, he knew jolly well he'd no business to have left it in the house that night, so he wanted to get out of it by making me suffer. You know, he's always been down on me. Well, I came straight up here and I told Auntie. Of course, I couldn't make a fuss with her ill in bed, so I simply told her I hadn't got the money and I hadn't stolen it, and I left it at that. I thought the less said, the better. But I had to say that much. I wonder what Julian would have said if he'd been accused. I just wonder." He repeated the word queerly, evocative. "Julian." "What did Mrs. Maldon say?" Rachel asked. "Well, she didn't say much. She believed me, naturally. And then old Batch came. I wasn't going to have a regular scene with him up there, so I left. I thought that was the only dignified thing to do. I wanted to tell you, and I've told you. Don't you think it's a shame?" Rachel answered passionately, "I do." She answered thus because she had a tremendous desire to answer thus. To herself she said, "Do I? Yes, I do." Louis' eyes drew sympathy out of her. It seemed to her to be of the highest importance that those appealing eyes should not appeal in vain. "Item, he made a fearful fuss about you and me being at the cinema last night." "I should like to know what it's got to do with him," said Rachel, almost savagely. The word "item" puzzled her. Not understanding it, she thought she had misheard. "That's what I thought too," said Louis, and added very gravely, "At the same time, I'm really awfully sorry. Perhaps I oughtn't to have asked you. It was my fault. But old Batch would make the worst of anything." Rachel replied with feverish conviction, "Mr. Batchgrew ought to be ashamed. You weren't to blame, and I won't hear of it." Louis started forward with a sudden movement of the left arm. "You're magnificent," he said with emotion. Rachel trembled and shut her eyes. She heard his voice again, closer to her, repeating with even greater emotion, "You're magnificent." Tears were in her eyes. Through them she looked at him, and his form was so graceful, his face so nice, so exquisitely kind and lovable and loving, that her admiration became intense, even to the point of pain. She thought of Batchgrew, not with hate, but with pity. He was a monster, but he could not help it. He alone was responsible for all slanders against Louis. He alone had put Mrs. Maldon against Louis. Louis was obviously the most innocent of beings. Mrs. Maldon's warning, "The woman who married him would suffer horribly," was manifestly absurd. Suffer horribly! What a stinging phrase, like a needle broken in a wound. She felt tired and weak, above all tired of loneliness. His hand was on hers. She trembled anew. She was not Rachel, but some new embodiment of surrender and acquiescence. And the change was delicious, fearful. She thought, "I could die for him." She forgot that a few minutes before she had been steeling herself against him. She wanted him to kiss her, and waited an eternity. And when he had kissed her, and she was in a maze of rapture, a tiny idea shaped itself clearly in her mind for an instant. "This is wrong, but I don't care. He is mine." And then melted like a cloud in a burning sky. And a sense of the miraculousness of destiny overcame her. In 2 days had happened enough for 2 years. It was staggering to think that only 2 days earlier she had been dreaming of him as of a star. Could so much indeed happen in 2 days? She imagined blissfully in her ignorance of human experience that her case was without precedent. Nay, her case appalled her in the rapidity of its development, and was thereby the more thrilling. She thought again, "Yes, I could die for him, and I would." He was still the star, but such was the miracle, she clasped him. They heard Mrs. Tams knocking at the door. Nothing would ever cure the charwoman's habit of knocking before entering. Rachel arose from the sofa as out of a bush of blossoms, and in the artless, honest glance of her virginity and her simplicity, her eyes seemed to say to Mrs. Tams, Behold the phoenix among men! He is to be my husband. Her pride in the strange, wondrous, incredible state of being affianced was tremendous, to the tragic point. "Can ye hear, begging your pardon?" said Mrs. Tams, pointing through the open door and upward. "Her's just begun to breathe o' that'n." The loud, stertorous sound of Mrs. Maldon unconsciously drawing the final breaths of life filled the whole house. Louis and Rachel glanced at each other, scared, shamed, even horrified, to discover that the vast pendulum of the universe was still solemnly ticking through their ecstasy. "I'm coming," said Rachel. End of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Christine Blashford, www.wokeupthismorning.co.uk. The Price of Love by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 9. The Married Woman. Part 1. Wonderful things happen. If anybody had foretold to Mrs. Tams that in her 58th year she would accede to the honourable order of the starched white cap, Mrs. Tams could not have credited the prophecy. But there she stood in the lobby of the house at Byker's, frocked in black, with the strings of a plain but fine white apron stretched round her stoutness, and the cap crowning her grey hair. It was Louis who had insisted on the cap, which Rachel had thought unnecessary and even snobbish, and which Mrs. Tams had nervously deprecated. Not without pleasure, however, had both women yielded to his indeed unanswerable argument: "You can't possibly have a servant opening the door without a cap. It's unthinkable." Thus, in her latter years of grandmotherhood, had Mrs. Tams cast off the sackcloth of the charwoman and become a glorious domestic servant with a room of her own in the house, and no responsibilities beyond the house, and no right to leave the house save once a week, when she visited younger generations who still took from her and gave nothing back. She owed the advancement to Rachel, who, quite unused to engaging servants, and alarmed by harrowing stories of the futility of registry offices and advertisements, had seen in Mrs. Tams the comfortable solution of a fearful problem. Louis would have preferred a younger, slimmer, nattier, fluffier creature than Mrs. Tams, but was ready to be convinced that such as he wanted lived only in his fancy. Moreover, he liked Mrs. Tams, and would occasionally flatter her by a smack on the shoulder. So in the April dusk Mrs. Tams stood in the windy lobby, and was full of vanity and the pride of life. She gazed forth in disdain at the little crowd of inquisitive idlers and infants that remained obstinately on the pavement, hoping against hope that the afternoon's marvellous series of social phenomena was not over. She scorned the slatternly, stupid little crowd for its lack of manners, yet she ought to have known, and she did know as well as any one, that though in Bursley itself people will pretend out of politeness that nothing unusual is afoot when something unusual most obviously is afoot, in the small suburbs of Bursley, such as Byker's, no human or divine power can prevent the populace from loosing its starved curiosity openly upon no matter what spectacle that may differ from the ordinary. Alas, Mrs. Tams in the past had often behaved even as the simple members of that crowd. Nevertheless, all ceremonies being over, she shut the front door with haughtiness, feeling glad that she was not as others are. And further, she was swollen and consequential because, without counting persons named Batchgrew, 2 visitors had come in a motor, and because at one supreme moment no less than 2 motors, including a Batchgrew motor, had been waiting together at the curb in front of her clean steps. Who could have foreseen this arrant snobbishness in the excellent child of nature, Mrs. Tams? A far worse example of spiritual iniquity sat lolling on the Chesterfield in the parlour. Ignorance and simplicity and a menial imitativeness might be an excuse for Mrs. Tams, but not for Rachel, the mistress, the omniscient, the all-powerful, the giver of good, who could make and unmake with a nod. Rachel, sitting gorgeous on the Chesterfield amid an enormous twilight welter and litter of disarranged chairs and tables, empty teapots, cups, jugs, and glasses, dishes of fragmentary remains of cake and chocolate, plates smeared with roseate ham, sticky teaspoons, loaded ashtrays, and a large general crummy mess. Rachel, the downright, the contemner of silly social prejudices and all nonsense, was actually puffed up because she had a servant in a cap, and because automobiles had deposited elegant girls at her door and whirled them off again, and she would have denied it, and yet was not ashamed. The sole extenuation of Rachel's base worldliness was that during the previous 6 months she had almost continuously had the sensations of a person crossing Niagara on a tightrope, and that now, on this very day, she had leapt to firm ground and was accordingly exultant. After Mrs. Maldon's death she had felt somehow guilty of disloyalty. She passionately regretted having had no opportunity to assure the old lady that her suspicions about Louis were wrong and cruel, and to prove to her in some mysterious way the deep rightness of the betrothal. She blushed only for the moment of her betrothal. She had solemnly bound Louis to keep the betrothal secret until Christmas. She had laid upon both of them a self-denying ordinance as to meeting. The funeral over, she was without a home. She wished to find another situation. Louis would not hear of it. She contemplated a visit to her father and brother in America. In response to a letter, her brother sent her the exact amount of the steerage fare, and, ready to accept it, she was astounded at Louis's fury against her brother, and at the accent with which he had spit out the word steerage. Her brother and father had gone steerage. However, she gave way to Louis, chiefly because she could not bear to leave him even for a couple of months. She was lodging at Knype at a total normal expense of 10 shillings a week. She possessed over £50, enough to keep her for 6 months and to purchase a trousseau, and not 1 penny would she deign to receive from her affianced. The disclosure of Mrs. Maldon's will increased the delicacy of her situation. Mrs. Maldon had left the whole of her property in equal shares to Louis and Julian absolutely. There were others who by blood had an equal claim upon her with these two, but the rest had been mere names to her, and she had characteristically risen above the conventionalism of heredity. Mr. Batchgrew, the executor, was able to announce that in spite of losses the heirs would get over £3,500 apiece. Hence it followed that Rachel would be marrying for money as well as for position. She trembled when the engagement was at length announced, and when Louis, after consultation with Mr. Batchgrew, pointed out that it would be advantageous not merely to the estate as a whole, but to himself and to her, if he took over the house at Bycars and its contents at a valuation and made it their married home, she at first declined utterly. The scheme seemed sacrilegious to her. How could she dare to be happy in that house where Mrs. Maldon had died, in that house which was so intimately Mrs. Maldon's? But the manifold excellences of the scheme, appealing strongly to her common sense, overcame her scruples. The dead are dead, the living must live, and the living must not be morbid. It would be absurd to turn into a pious monument every house which death has emptied. Mrs. Maldon, had she known all the circumstances, would have been only too pleased, etc., etc. The affair was settled, and grew into public knowledge. Rachel had to emerge upon the world as an engaged girl. Left to herself, she would have shunned all formalities, but Louis, bred up in Barnes, knew what was due to society. Naught was omitted. Louis's persuasiveness could not be withstood. Withal, he was so right, and though Rachel in one part of her mind had a contempt for fuss, in another she liked it and was half ashamed of liking it. Further, her common sense, of which she was still proud, told her that the delicacy of her situation demanded fuss, and would be much assuaged thereby. And finally, the whole thing, being miraculous, romantic, and incredible, had the quality of a dream through which she lived in a dazed nonchalance. Could it be true that she had resided with Mrs. Maldon only for a month? Could it be true that her courtship had lasted only 2 days, or at most 3? Never, she thought, had a sensible, quiet girl ridden such a whirlwind before in the entire history of the world. Could Louis be as foolishly fond of her as he seemed? Was she truly to be married? "I shan't have a single wedding present," she had said. Then wedding presents began to come. "Are we married?" she had said, when they were married, and in the conventional clothes in the conventional vehicle. After that she soon did realize that the wondrous and the unutterable had happened to her too. And she swung over to the other extreme. Instead of doubting the reality of her own experiences, she was convinced that her experiences were more real than those of any other created girl, and hence she felt a slight condescension towards all the rest. "I am a married woman," she reflected at intervals, with intense momentary pride. And her fits of confusion in public would end in recurrences of this strange, proud feeling. Then she had to face the return to Bursley, and later the "at home" which Louis propounded as a matter of course, and which she knew to be inevitable. The house was her toy, and Mrs. Tams was her toy, but the glee of playing with toys had been overshadowed for days by the delicious dread of the "at home." "It will be the first caller that will kill me," she had said, "but will anybody really come?" And the first caller had called, and finding herself still alive, she had become radiant, and often during the afternoon had forgotten to be clumsy. The success of the "at home" was prodigious, startling. Now and then, when the room was full, and people without chairs perched on the end of the Chesterfield, she had whispered to her secret heart in a tiny, tiny voice, "These are my guests. They all treat me with special deference. I am the hostess. I am Mrs. Fores." The Batchgrew clan was well represented, no doubt by order from authority. Mrs. Yardley came, in surprising stylishness. Visitors arrived from Knype. Miss Malkin came and atoned for her historic glance in the shop. But the dazzlers were sundry male friends of Louis, with Kensingtonian accents, strange phrases, and assurance in the handling of teacups and the choosing of cake. One by one and two by two they had departed, and at last Rachel, with the mind as it were breathless from rapid flittings to and fro, was seated alone on the sofa. She was richly dressed in a dark blue taffeta dress that gave brilliance to her tawny hair. Perhaps she was over richly dressed, for, like many girls who as a rule are not very interested in clothes, she was too interested in them at times, and inexperienced taste was apt to mislead her into an unfitness. Also, her figure was too stiff and sturdy to favour elegance. But on this occasion the general effect of her was notably picturesque, and her face and hair and the expression of her pose atoned in their charm for the shortcomings and the luxuriance of the frock. She was no more the Rachel that Mrs Maldon had known and that Louis had first kissed. Her glance had altered, and her gestures. She would ask herself, could it be true that she was a married woman? But her glance and gestures announced it true at every instant. A new languor and a new confidence had transformed the girl. Her body had been modified, and her soul at once chastened and fired. Fresh in her memory was endless matter for meditation, and on the sofa, in a negligent attitude of repose, with shameless eyes gazing far into the caverns of the fire, and an unreadable faint smile on her face, she meditated. And she was the most seductive, tantalizing, self-contradictory object for study in the whole of Bursley. She had never been so interesting as in this brief period, and she might never be so interesting again. Mrs. Tams entered. With her voice Mrs. Tams said, "Shall I begin to clear all these things away, ma'am?" But with her self-conscious eyes Mrs. Tams said to the self-conscious eyes of Rachel, "What a staggering world we live in, don't we?" II. Rachel sprang from the Chesterfield, smoothed down her frock, shook her hair, and then ran upstairs to the large front bedroom where Louis, to whom the house was just as much a toy as to Rachel, was about to knock a nail into a wall. Out of breath she stood close to him very happily. The At Home was over. She was now definitely received as a married woman in a town full of married women and girls waiting to be married women. She had passed successfully through a trying and exhausting experience. The nervous tension was slackened, and therefore it might be expected that she would have a sense of reaction, the vague melancholy which is produced when that which has long been seen before is suddenly seen behind. But it was not so in the smallest degree. Every moment of her existence equally was thrilling and happy. One piquant joy was succeeded immediately by another as piquant. To Rachel it was not in essence more exciting to officiate at an At Home than to watch Louis drive a nail into a wall. The man winked at her in the dusk. She winked back, and put her hand intimately on his shoulder. She thought, "I am safe with him now in this house." The feeling of solitude with him, of being barricaded against the world, and at the mercy of Louis alone, was exquisite to her. Then Louis raised himself on his toes, and raised his left arm with the nail as high as he could, and stuck the point of the nail against a pencil mark on the wall. Then he raised the right hand with the hammer, but the mark was just too high to be efficiently reached by both hands simultaneously. Louis might have stood on a chair. This simple device, however, was too simple for them. Rachel said, "Shall I stand on a chair and hold the nail for you?" Louis murmured, "Brainy little thing, never at a loss." She skipped on to a chair and held the nail. Towering thus above him, she looked down on her husband and thought, "This man is mine alone, and he is all mine." And in Rachel's fancy the thought itself seemed to caress Louis from head to foot. "Supposing I catch you one?" said Louis, as he prepared to strike. "I don't care," said Rachel. And the fact was that really she would have liked him to hit her finger instead of the nail. Not too hard, but still smartly. She would have taken pleasure in the pain. Such was the perversity of the young wife. But Louis hit the nail infallibly every time. He took up a picture which had been lying against the wall in a dark corner, and thrust the twisting wire of it over the nail. Rachel, when in the deepening darkness she had peered into the frame, exclaimed, pouting, "Oh, darling, you aren't going to hang that here, are you? It's so old-fashioned. You said it was old-fashioned yourself. I did want that thing that came this morning to be put somewhere here. Why can't you stick this in the spare room? Unless, of course, you prefer..." She was being deferential to the art expert in him, as well as to the husband. "Not in the least," said Louis, acquiescent, and unhooked the picture. Taste changes. The rejected of Rachel was a watercolour by the late Athelstan Maldon, adored by Mrs. Maldon. Already it had been degraded from the parlour to the bedroom, and now it was to be pushed away like a shame into obscurity. It was a view of the celebrated Vale of Llangollen, finicking, tight, and hard in manner, but with a certain sentiment and modest skill. The way in which the initials A.M. had been hidden amid the foreground foliage in the left-hand corner disclosed enough of the painter's quiet and proud temperament to show that he "took after" his mother. Yet a few more years, and the careless observer would miss those initials altogether, and would be contemptuously inquiring, "Who did this old daub, I wonder?" And nobody would know who did the old daub, or that the old daub for 30 years had been an altar for undying affection, and also a distinguished specimen, admired by a whole generation of townsfolk of the art of watercolour. And the fate of Athelstan's sketch was symptomatic. Mrs. Maldon's house had been considered perfect up to the time of her death. Rachel had at first been even intimidated by it. Louis had sincerely praised it. And indeed its perfection was an axiom of drawing-room conversation. But as soon as Louis and Rachel began to look on the house with the eye of inhabitants, the axiom fell to a dogma, and the dogma was exploded. The dreadful truth came out that Mrs. Maldon had shown a strange indifference to certain aspects of convenience, and that, in short, she must have been a peculiar old lady with ideas of her own. Louis proved unanswerably that in the hitherto faultless parlour the furniture was ill arranged, and suddenly the sideboard and the Chesterfield had changed places, and all concerned had marvelled that Mrs. Maldon had for so long kept the Chesterfield where so obviously the sideboard ought to have been, and the sideboard where so obviously the Chesterfield ought to have been. And still graver matters had come to light. The house had an attic floor, which was unused, and the scene of no activity except spring cleaning. A previous owner, infected by the virus of modernity, had put a bath into one of the attics. Now Mrs. Maldon, as experiments disclosed, had actually had the water cut off from the bath. Eyebrows were lifted at the revelation of this caprice. The restoration of the supply of water and the installing of a geyser were the only expenditures which thrifty Rachel had sanctioned in the way of rejuvenating the house. Rachel had decided that the house must, at any rate for the present, be made to do. That such a decision should be necessary astonished Rachel, and Mrs. Maldon would have been more than astonished to learn that the lady help, by fortitude and determination, was making her perfect house do. As regards the household inventory, Rachel had been obliged to admit exceptions to her rule of endurance. Perhaps her main reason for agreeing to live in the house had been that there would be no linen to buy. But truly Mrs. Maldon's notion of what constituted a sufficiency of, for example, towels, was quite too inadequate. Louis protested that he could comfortably use all Mrs. Maldon's towels in half a day. More towels had to be obtained. There were other shortages, but some of them were set right by means of veiled indications to prospective givers of gifts. "You mean that Garden of the Hesperides affair for up here, do you?" said Louis. Rachel gazed around the bedchamber. A memory of what it had been shot painfully through her mind, for the room was profoundly changed in character. 2 narrow bedsteads given by Thomas Batchgrew and described by Mrs. Tams in a moment of daring as "flighty" had taken the place of Mrs. Maldon's bedstead, which was now in the spare room, the spare room bedstead having been allotted to Mrs. Tams, and Rachel's old bedstead sold. Bright crocheted and embroidered wedding presents enlivened the pale tones of the room. The wardrobe, washstand, dressing-table, chairs, carpet, and ottoman remained. But there were razors on the washstand and boot trees under it. The wardrobe had been emptied and filled on strange principles with strange raiment, and the Maldon family Bible, instead of being on the ottoman, was in the ottoman, so as to be out of the dust. "Perhaps we may as well keep that here after all," said Rachel, indicating Athelstan's watercolour. Her voice was soft. She remembered that the name of Mrs. Maldon, only a little while since a major notability of Bursley, and the very mirror of virtuous renown, had been mentioned but once, and even then apologetically, during the afternoon. Louis asked sharply, "Why, if you don't care for it? I don't." "Well," said Rachel, "as you like then, dearest." Louis walked out of the room with the watercolour, and in a moment returned with a photogravure of Lord Leighton's The Garden of the Hesperides, in a coquettish gold frame, a gift newly arrived from Louis's connections in the United States. The marmoreal and academic work seemed wonderfully warm and original in that room at Bycars. Rachel really admired it, and admired herself for admiring it. But when Louis had hung it and flicked it into exact perpendicularity, and they had both exclaimed upon its brilliant effect even in the dusk, Rachel saw it also with the eyes of Mrs. Maldon, and wondered what Mrs. Maldon would have thought of it opposite her bed, and knew what Mrs. Maldon would have thought of it. And then, the job being done, and the progress of civilization assured, Louis murmured in a new appealing voice, "I say, Louise." Louise was perhaps his most happy invention, and the best proof that Louis was Louis. Upon hearing that her full Christian names were Rachel Louisa, he had instantly said, "I shall call you Louise." Rachel was ravished. Louisa is a vulgar name, at least it is vulgar in the Five Towns, where every second general servant bears it. But Louise was full of romance, distinction, and beauty, and it was the perfect complement to Louis. Louis and Louise, ideal coincidence. "But nobody except me is to call you Louise," he had added, and thus completed her bliss. "What?" she encouraged him amorously. "Suppose we go to Llandudno on Saturday for the week-end?" His tone was gay, gentle, innocent, persuasive. Yet the words stabbed her, and her head swam. "But why?" she asked, controlling her utterance. "Oh, well, be rather a lark, wouldn't it?" It was when he talked in this strain that the inconvenient voice of sagacity within her would question for one agonizing instant whether she was more secure as the proud, splendid wife of Louis Fores than she had been as a mere lady help; and the same insistent voice would repeat the warnings which she had had from Mrs. Maldon and from Thomas Batchgrew, and would remind her of what she herself had said to herself when Louis first kissed her: "This is wrong, but I don't care. He is mine." Upon hearing of his inheritance from Mrs. Maldon, Louis was for throwing up immediately his situation at Horrocleave's. Rachel had dissuaded him from such irresponsible madness. She had prevented him from running into 100 expenses during their engagement and in connection with the house. And he had in the end enthusiastically praised her common sense. But that very morning at the midday meal he had surprised her by announcing that, on account of the reception, he should not go to the works at all in the afternoon, though he had omitted to warn Horrocleave. Ultimately she had managed by guile to dispatch him to the works for 2 hours, and now in the evening he was alarming her afresh. Why go to Llandudno? What point was there in rushing off to Llandudno and scattering in 3 days more money than they could save in 3 weeks? He frightened her ingrained prudence, and her alarm was only increased by his obvious failure to realize the terrible defect in himself, for to her it was terrible. The joyous scheme of an excursion to Llandudno had suddenly crossed his mind, exciting the appetite for pleasure. Hence the appetite must be immediately indulged. Rachel had been brought up otherwise, and as a direct result of Louis' irresponsible suggestion she had a vision of the house with county court bailiffs lodged in the kitchen. She had only to say, "Yes, let's go," and they would be off on the absurd and wicked expedition. "I'd really rather not," she said, smiling but serious. "All serene. But anyhow, next week's Easter, and we shall have to go somewhere then, you know." She put her hands on his shoulders and looked close at him, knowing that she must use her power, and that the heavy dusk would help her. "Why?" she asked again. "I'd much sooner stay here at Easter. Truly I would. With you." The episode ended with an embrace. She had won. Very well, said Louis. "Easter in the coal cellar, if you like. I'm on for anything." "But don't you see, dearest?" she said, and he imitated her emphasis, full of teasing good humour. "Yes, I see, dearest." She breathed relief and asked, "Are you going to give me my bicycle lesson?" III. Louis had borrowed a bicycle for Rachel to ruin while learning to ride. He said that a friend had lent it to him, a man in Hanbridge whose mother had given up riding on account of stoutness. But who exactly this friend was Rachel knew not, Louis' information being characteristically sketchy and incomplete, and with his air of candour and good humour he had a strange way of warding off questions, so that already Rachel had grown used to a phrase which she would utter only in her mind: "I don't like to ask him." It pleased Louis to ride this bicycle out of the backyard, down the sloping entry, and then steer it to another narrow gateway, across the pavement, and let it solemnly bump, first with the front wheel and then with the back wheel, from the pavement into the road. During this feat he stood on the pedals. He turned the machine up Byker's Lane and steadily climbed the steep at Rachel's walking pace, and Rachel, hurrying by his side, watched in the obscurity the play of his ankles as he put into practice the principles of pedalling which he had preached. He was a graceful rider. Every movement was natural and elegant. Rachel considered him to be the most graceful cyclist that ever was. She was fascinated by the revolutions of his feet. She felt ecstatically happy. The episode of his caprice for the seaside was absolutely forgotten. After all, she asked for nothing more than possession of him, and she had that, though indeed it seemed too marvellous to be true. The bicycle lesson was her hour of magic, and more so on this night than on previous nights. "I must change my dress," she had said. "I can't go in this one." "Quick, then." His impatience could not wait. He had helped her. He undid hooks and fastened others. The rich blue frock lay across the bed and looked lovely on the ivory-coloured counterpane. It seemed indeed to be a part of that in her which was Louise. Then she was in a short skirt which she had devised herself, and he was pushing her out of the room, his hand on her back. And she had feigned reluctance, resisting his pressure, while laughing with gleeful eagerness to be gone. No delay had been allowed. As they passed through the kitchen, not one instant for parley with Mrs. Tams as to the domestic organization of the evening, he was still pushing her. Thus she had had to confide her precious house and its innumerable treasures to Mrs. Tams, and in this surrender to Louis' whim there was a fearful joy. When Louis turned at last into Park Road and stepped from between the wheels, she exclaimed, a little breathless from quick walking level with him up the hill, "I can't bear to see you ride so well. Oh!" She crunched her teeth with a loving, cruel gesture. "I should like to hurt you frightfully." "What for?" "Because I shall never, never be able to ride as well as you do." He winked. "Here, take hold." "I'm not ready, I'm not ready!" she cried. But he loosed the machine, and she was obliged to seize it as it fell. That was his teasing. Park Road had been the scene of the lesson for 3 nights. It was level, and it was unfrequented. "And the doctor's handy in case you break your neck," Louis had said. Dr. Yardley's red lamp shone amicably among yellow lights, and its ray with theirs was lost in the mysterious obscurities of the closed park. Not only was it socially advisable for Rachel to study the perverse nature of the bicycle at night, for not to know how to ride the bicycle was as shameful as not to know how to read and write, but she preferred the night for the romantic feeling of being alone with Louis in the dark and above the glow of the town. She loved the sharp night wind on her cheek, and the faint clandestine rustling of the low evergreens within the park palisade, and the invisible and almost tangible soft sky revealed round the horizon by gleams of fire. She had longed to ride the bicycle as some girls long to follow the hunt or to steer an automobile or a yacht, and now her ambition was being attained amid all circumstances of bliss. And yet she would shrink from beginning the lesson. "The lamp! You've forgotten to light the lamp," she said. "Get on," said he. "But suppose a policeman come?" "Suppose you get on and start. Do you think I don't know you? Policemen are my affair. Besides, all nice policemen are in bed. Don't be afraid. It isn't alive. I've got hold of the thing. Sit well down. No, there are only 2 pedals. You seem to think there are about 19. Right. No, no, no! Do not cling to those blooming handlebars as if you were in a storm at sea. Be a nice little cat in front of the fire, all your muscles loose. Now. Are you ready?" "Yes," she murmured, with teeth set and dilated eyes staring ahead at the hideous dangers of Park Road. He impelled. The pedals went round. The machine slid terribly forward. And in a moment Louis said mischievously, "I told you you'd have a go alone tonight. There you are." His footsteps ceased. "Louis!" she cried, sharply, and yet sadly upbraiding his unspeakable treason. Her fingers gripped convulsively the handlebars. She was moving alone. It was inconceivably awful and delightful. She was on the back of a wild pony in the forest. The miracle of equilibrium was being accomplished. The impossible was done, and at the first attempt. She thought very clearly how wondrous was life, and how perfectly happy fate had made her. And then she was lying in a tangle amid dozens of complex wheels, chains, and bars. "Hurt?" shouted Louis as he ran up. She laughed and said "No," and sat up stiffly, full of secret dolours. Yet he knew, and she knew, that the accidents of the previous 2 nights had covered her limbs with blue discolorations, and that the latest fall was more severe than any previous one. Her courage enchanted Louis, and filled him with a sense of security. She was not graceful in these exercises. Her ankles were thick and clumsy. Not merely had she no natural aptitude for physical feats, apparently she was not lissom nor elegant in motion, but what courage, what calm, bright endurance, what stoicism! Most girls would have reproached him for betraying them to destruction, would have pouted, complained, demanded petting and apologies. But not she. She was like a man. And when he helped her to pick herself up, he noticed that after all she was both lissom and agile, and exquisitely, disturbingly girlish in her short, dusty skirt, and that she did trust him and depend on him. And he realized that he was safe for life with her. She was created for him. Work was resumed. "Now don't let go of me till I tell you," she enjoined lightly. "I won't," he answered, and it seemed to him that his loyalty to her expanded and filled all his soul. Later, as she approached the other end of Park Road, near Moorthorne Road, a tramcar hurled itself suddenly down Moorthorne Road and overthrew her. It is true that the tramcar was never less than 20 yards away from her, but even at 20 yards it could overthrow. Rachel sat dazed in the road, and her voice was uncertain as she told Louis to examine the bicycle. One of the pedals was bent and prevented the back wheel from making a complete revolution. "It's nothing," said Louis. "I'll have it right in the morning." "Who's that?" Rachel, who had risen, gasping, turned to him excitedly as he was bending over the bicycle. Conscious that somebody had been standing at the corner of the street, he glanced up. A figure was moving quickly down Moorthorne Road in the direction of the station. "I dunno," said he. "It's not Julian, is it?" In a peculiar tone Louis replied, "Looks like him, doesn't it?" And then impulsively he yelled, "Hi!" The figure kept on its way. "Seeing that the inimitable Julian's still in South Africa, it can't very well be him, and anyhow I'm not going to run after him." "No, of course it can't," Rachel assented. Presently the returning procession was reformed. Louis pushed the bicycle on its front wheel, and Rachel tried to help him to support the weight of the suspended part. He had attempted in vain to take the pedal off the crank. "It's perhaps a good thing you fell just then," said Louis, "because old Batch is coming in to-night, and we better not be late." "But you never told me." "Didn't I? I forgot," he said blandly. "Oh, Louis, he's not coming for supper, I hope." "My child, if there's a chance of a free meal, old Batch will be on the spot." The unaccustomed housewife foretold her approaching shame, and proclaimed Louis to be the author of it. She began to quicken her steps. "You certainly ought to have let me know sooner, dearest," she said seriously. "You really are terrible." Hard knocks had not hurt her, but she was hurt now, and Louis' smile was very constrained. Her grave manner of saying "dearest" had disquieted him. End of chapter 9.